A lot of what I've learned personally about usability and actionable knowledge has come from studying the RISAs and water managers in particular on the west, southwest, and southeast coasts. And the things I've noticed is that, like Bet summarized, that these tend to be, the most proactive water utilities tend to be the larger regional water utilities that do have lots of resources to put to bear. They usually come with sophisticated models and things like that. And I think that, and they tend to look very long term because, as Bet said, that the risks are really acute if they can't provide water to their publics. And so a lot of the stories that I heard when I was conducting interviews for that research was about, these very sophisticated, very technical people on the water side trying to understand the climate in a way where they feel more comfortable, and then I think to some degree wanting the climate scientists, climate brokers to understand their world a little bit and their models a little bit so that information gelled a little bit better and fit better. So I think having the space for those conversations and allowing them to progress was an important component to being able to use the information. Now that I'm working on the East Coast, I see a totally different situation where they're, I feel like, a decade or more behind, maybe a couple of decades behind. There aren't the sophisticated models. They're much smaller, at least in Connecticut, the water systems. And yet there are some that are interested in using climate information. And so part of my challenge is so some have resources, but they're constrained in other ways in that the risks are different. Drought's certainly a concern, but it's stormwater, water quality issues, things that we haven't gotten as good with, adapting climate information to inform those types of decisions, and at much smaller scales. We're not talking about like the scale of the Colorado River or a big watershed. We're talking about much finer grained scales. And so I'm wondering, so I've learned all of this in, about usability and all these in the RISA context and with larger water utilities, but how do we apply those lessons, or how do we adapt what we've learned in those contexts to these other contexts where you might have smaller water utilities trying to take advantage, or different types of problems, less about snowpack and water supplies in big rivers, and more about these local issues or local concerns that are different, water quality and the like. The other thing I think in terms of the structure is that they're very attuned to, there's long-lived infrastructure in place, and I have a couple of new projects on water and wastewater resilience, and so I'm sort of finding myself again moving away from water supply to wastewater and stormwater, and then water utilities on the East Coast, which look a little bit different, and trying to understand or trying to apply the lessons that we've learned again in the water supply context in these other areas where there's different motivations at play and different constraints in terms of the built infrastructure and what the challenges they face now. I guess the last story or last comment I would share is that I observed for a year and a half some interaction between climate brokers and dam operators, stormwater managers, floodplain managers, and the like. And while we had a set of very motivated individuals in the room, in the end, climate information never did, come to, even over a year and a half of meetings every month or so, never really were able to bring that climate information to bear to inform the different types of decisions that water managers around the room were trying to make. And so I think that, on the one hand, we think that we've sort of solved some of the interaction problem or the climate piece, and that we just have to kind of figure out the right way to disseminate it, or the right, whatever. But I think that there's this whole other area where we haven't, all these other types of applications that may or may not actually, be able to be informed by climate science. And yet, how do we negotiate those spaces and inform resilience efforts in that area, and advance this work productively? In terms of the political environment, I forgot to mention that I think in some regard that water managers are considered the expert, and so I think one advantage of working with water managers at local utility level is that in some regard they can step around the political or politicization of science and climate change as a problem, because they are viewed as the expert, and so they can bring climate in to inform decision making if it can, rather than get mired in the politics of it. And where that doesn't seem to play well is when I've done some work with state agencies where the politics really does seem to invade and diminish our ability to bring climate information in, and unless you're calling it some other thing. So that's it. I hope that helps.